And then here, these are mental health experts and climate advocates. Please welcome Jylana Sheats, Kate Schapira, and Sarah Newman. Thank you for being here. Thank you. And take it away, Kyra. Thank you.
Hello. How are you guys doing?
Great.
It's a little hot here. Okay, great. Thank you all for being here. So as Esteban mentioned, we are going to be talking about climate anxiety. And after talking to these lovely ladies, I thought we would start with a little exercise that they inspired me with. So you don't necessarily have to close your eyes. I can't see that far, but maybe try. And I want everyone to think about all the face emojis and think about which of the face emojis you think of when you think about climate change. Is it sobbing face emoji? Is it rage emoji? Is it the melting face? I would argue, and I think everyone here would agree, unless it was the neutral face or happy, which would be weird, that betrays some emotion you have about what's going on the planet. And for a lot of people, that emotion or a central part of that emotion is anxiety. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So I wanted to start with a really basic question. What is climate anxiety? How would you all characterize that? And maybe, Sarah, I'll start with you.
Sure. It's great to be here. So I would say that having climate anxiety or emotions related to the climate crisis are from both direct experiences. This is experiencing extreme weather and other events because of the climate crisis, and that's going to bring up a lot of different emotions. And then also indirect experiences. So this is reading the news about the climate crisis, learning about it in school. That also brings up a range of emotions in people.
Any additional definitions you guys want to have?
Can you hear me all right?
Oh, no.
How about now?
Yeah.
Yay, there we go. I think I would add that it doesn't have to be anxiety to come under this heading. You might not call it anxiety. A lot of the people who talk to me about it say, I'm stressed, I'm overwhelmed, I'm tired. They might say something like, I give up, or I don't have any hope for this. And although those things aren't anxiety in the sense of worry or in the sense of something that you would like take medicine for, I think they come into this realm of understanding climate realities and their urgency and feeling a disconnect between what you know should happen and what is happening.
And I'll just add a bit more context. As we all know, there's been an unprecedented number of people impacted by climate change due to extreme weather events and other climate-related weather. For example, droughts, floods, heat waves, tornadoes, hurricanes. And this is really taking its toll on people. There was a study by Dr. Caroline Hickman that found that, and this was actually a global study, including youth from the US between ages 16 and 25. And it found that 60% of young people were concerned about climate. And another 45% of those surveyed felt that climate change impacted their daily activities and functioning. And so when we talk about climate anxiety, it's very real. And as my wonderful panelists have said, you know, it can be a range of emotions from sadness to anger to grief to anxiety to even guilt. And so this is a very real thing that's impacting people in different ways, but it's not abnormal. You know, it's a normal reaction to this type of threat.
You sort of touched on this, but I want to zero in on it. A misconception I've heard, or a perception that I've heard, is that climate anxiety, to experience that or feel that, is a privilege. That it's a signal that you don't have real problems in your life. And if you were worried about paying your bills, if you were worried about health, you wouldn't have the liberty of waking up every day and worrying about emissions. I could sort of guess that none of you would agree with that sentiment, but what do you say to that mentality?
Well, I would just say, my first response was, if someone is stressed, if they are experiencing grief, then that's impacting their functioning, the way they see the world, the way they engage in their everyday life. And so it's going to impact your ability to do all the things. And so I think that, you know, saying that it's like a privilege to experience that, no, it's not a privilege. Ask many racial and ethnic minority communities who actually contribute least to climate change, but are impacted the most. And so a lot of people think that, climate change is a quote unquote white thing or thing for youth, when in actuality, there's been research that has showed that, and this was a study out of Yale, Sarah and I was just talking about it, where Hispanic Americans were 5 times more likely to be concerned about climate change relative to other racial and ethnic groups. And Black Americans were 2 times more likely. So there are a lot of misconceptions about people's concerns about climate change and experiencing climate anxiety.
100%. And I have a story that I think illustrates this, actually. I have a climate anxiety counseling booth that I made. It's going to be over there in a minute. You can come talk to me there. And one of the people who talked to me in the first season, I've been doing this for about 10 years, was a man of color, young-ish, I think, who came up and said, it's so hot, and I really want to take my kid swimming, but I don't have time because I have to work. And we can't afford to run the air conditioner. It's so hot, and he's disabled, and it's hard for me to explain to him why he's suffering. And this was somebody who couldn't be the kind of dad that he wanted to be in the present of 10 years ago because of climate impacts. And thinking about how climate change is a threat multiplier, how it interacts with the other oppressions and the other harmful structures that people live within, thinking about how one reason why the numbers that Jylana shared are what they are is that people of color, Black people, Indigenous people are often redlined into dangerous living conditions. If you don't know what redlining is, come talk to me after the show. They're often living nearest to the effects of pollution. So anxiety, I think one part of that misconception is that anxiety is always about stuff that hasn't happened yet. But anxiety can also be very much about stuff that is happening and that can happen more.
Yeah, and even in the research, there's shown evidence of like people having PTSD. I used to do neighborhood research in New Orleans, and some of the research focused on understanding how where people live can impact their health and well-being. And this was maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and even though Hurricane Katrina had happened almost 2 decades earlier, as we walk through people's communities, they often reflected on what Hurricane Katrina did to their neighborhood and how it changed their life, and even how they thought about their life. It was before Katrina and after Hurricane Katrina. And even as a resident in New Orleans, this is what I heard all the time. I once went to a funeral, and in reading my friend's mother's obituary, they said, well, before Katrina, she did this. After Katrina, she did this job. So that is really how, life, is kind of looked at through that lens of that extreme weather event. So again, to really say that it's a privilege, not so much, especially if you're experiencing all these emotions.
I mean, Katrina kind of gets at this, but I'm curious if in your experience talking to people, are there consistent inflection points where anxiety spikes? And I would assume extreme weather is one of them, but do you hear from people when X happens, that's a moment that my anxiety gets really high when it comes to climate? Maybe Kate, I'll go to you first since you're constantly counseling people.
Yeah. Could I see some hands for folks who are from Seattle or from this part of the world? Okay, is it usually this hot? Is it supposed to be this hot? How you feeling about it? Don't answer that right now, but I am seeing a couple of thumbs down. So I think that like weather conditions that are not usual are inflection points. Those are moments when people are awake to this situation, especially if it's uncomfortable. That I would say that's one. And then the other is when there is something dramatic happening on the news that people consume that's far away that they feel helpless to respond to.
Yeah.
I would also add, in addition to everything Kate was saying, that when there's systems failures, that there's also that can be an inflection point. That there's, if you're following the news of a cop, for example, and if the outcome of that cop is not what we need and what people are working towards, that also is a point of inflection, because this is really about systems failures and systems opportunities. And so when individuals or, and communities are seeing systems failing them in, global climate negotiations, in responses to climate disasters, in climate preparedness, in so many aspects of addressing the climate crisis, that when there is this systems level failures, that also really compounds the range of emotions that people might be experiencing, including that anger or anxiety or fear about either what's happening now or the potential in the future.
Yeah. So it's even like the extreme weather event kind of exacerbates, it's like very layered. So there's already things that are going on, frustration with these systems. And then, these climate change related events just make it that much worse.
Sort of people feel like it's just one event away from things falling apart in a certain way. Yeah. And very helpless to do anything about it individually.
And I'll just add one other thing, or even if they've experienced an extreme weather event previously. So if it starts to rain or they hear about something, then that can lead someone to have anxiety and be very fearful.
I want to ask about climate denial, because I would not typically, I think of that as sort of like absolving yourself of the entire problem. But do you think that that's a form of climate anxiety in a way, or a way of processing an inability to kind of deal with the scope of the problem? Sarah?
Sure. Well, first, the Yale program on climate change communications they do a lot of excellent research, including a study annually called the 6 Americas. And the latest one found that the majority of Americans are, I have to get the right language, but it's concerned, worried, concerned, or cautious about the climate crisis. So this is across all political affiliations and so forth. So I think, one, the idea that yes, there are still people who don't believe in the science of climate change, but they are very much in the minority. And then I think also at the same time that sometimes when you're talking about the climate crisis, it is so overwhelming, and that people will shut down, that, going into a numb state is a physiological and an emotional response to the scariness of the climate crisis and the sense of powerlessness. And so there's kind of a spectrum of someone could be numb and someone could be hypervigilant. And that numbness can sometimes come in the form of denial, might not necessarily be climate denial per se, but it could be denial of, well, I don't need to worry about this, or this is too big, like I'm one person type of thing. But I will say, though, that we are at the point where the majority of Americans believe in the science of climate and are on that spectrum of being concerned about it.
And I would add to that, we mentioned systems failure as like kind of an inflection point or a pain point when people's anxiety spikes. I think our systems have climate denial. I think our systems deny climate change. Our systems are built and predicated largely, although I think that is changing somewhat. And I think some of you all out there are doing some work to change it, on the idea that things can work the same way forever, regardless of how warm it is, how wet it is, how dry it is. And I think that can sometimes manifest in individual, ordinary people's reactions as the kind of numbness that Sarah is describing. If you know that something's going on, but the systems around you are not acting like it's going on, it is very hard to maintain like activity, engagement, aliveness in the face of what feels like the world is denying the reality that you see.
Okay, we've bummed everyone out a lot. So now, yes, I fully agree. I want to move on to solutions and some of the coping mechanisms that you all deal with. And I want to believe that everyone in our crowd here is interested in those solutions and has experienced some form of climate anxiety. What is, if we had to like simplify it down, the number one thing you tell people when they come to you and sort of express this kind of fear?
Do you want me to start? I would say it's kind of twofold. You're not alone, and having climate emotions is a normal response to the climate crisis. It shows that you care, that you're engaged, and that not having climate anxiety, that's the abnormal response. So having climate anxiety, this is a very normal response to the climate crisis, and you are not alone with having this range of emotions.
Because of the way that I do the thing that I do, I usually start with questions. So my first question is like, how are you feeling about this? Or do you have any climate anxieties you'd like to share today? And then when they tell me what they're feeling, I say, well, what have you tried? Because before I suggest anything or remark on anything, I want to know more about where they are. And then I usually you'll find out if you come and talk to me, but I usually do some combination of, saying, you're not alone. Like this is a reasonable response to what's going on, but to also say like, what can you do? Because I think people who come to me often come to me from a point of like, that is very really like, I'm only one person. What can I do? And I'm like, well, let's make it a real question. What can you do? But no, go ahead.
Oh, okay. I'll just add that, climate anxiety, it's kind of like a continuum from like mild to severe, and it impacts people in different ways. And so when thinking about a coping solution, what works for me might be different for you. And so I think some people, just receiving self-care, for some people going out, spending time to connect with nature, with others, it may motivate them to be activists and go out and do something. Sarah and I talked earlier that whatever they do, it still could be different. Someone might want to protest where someone else might say, I think we'll plant trees. So everybody can kind of like contribute and address it in a different way, but they're still kind of working towards resolving how they feel about the climate anxiety. So I think it just kind of depends. But I think one thing that the ultimate goal should be to kind of just build resilience. I think resilience is super important for this.
And all those things that Jylana mentioned, I don't know if you noticed, but they're all things that people do together. No. That is the key, I think, to all of this is if you're going to do something with people. If you're going to feel something, talk with someone about how you're feeling. Mm-hmm. The power that we can find to meet this situation comes from talking together and doing things together.
Exactly.
I remember when the Canadian wildfire smoke happened last year, and New Yorkers freaked out, and much of the country did. But being in New York, that was the version of it I experienced. And also out of Yale, we wrote a story that touched on this idea of the spiral of silence, and the idea that people, even though the sky was orange, even though you couldn't breathe, even though the guidance was like, don't go outside, people sort of look around and see everyone else going on about their day, and they think, well, they're acting normal, so I'll act normal, and you just keep on keeping on, and you end up normalizing something that is not normal. And it just sort of feeds on itself, and talking about it is like the first step to sort of break that cycle.
Yeah. There's a huge value in talking about climate emotions as much as possible to destigmatize this, and so that this is just par for the course, being able to say, I have climate anxiety and my name's Sarah, or whatever it might be.
Hi, Sarah.
We need to have those, that this needs to be a cultural norm. It is a norm, but it's not cultural norm. It's not discussed in a mass way. And that by talking about one's emotions, that this is really, I see that this is an important step to broadening the conversation about the climate crisis and being able to engage more people. That so many people are so reticent to talk about it because of the fear. And so if you start in one of the most vulnerable places possible, as opposed to having a conversation about a news story or technology or whatever it might be, start with your own vulnerability and people are going to respond. And we need to have those conversations to be able to connect more deeply with each other, to have those community connections. And so that this is the norm, that when there is, the dangerous wildfire smoke in, the Eastern Seaboard, that people understand like, hey, I'm not going to go outside. Like this gives me anxiety. And also I'm going to take care of my health and my community's health.
Yeah.
All of you have touched on the sort of universality of this, that we are all going through this, and that one of the biggest things you can do is sort of take yourself out of a place of isolation and talk to other people. It makes me curious if in talking to people, do you find like perfect diversity in the types of people who are experiencing this in terms of age and gender and profession? Or do you find that that certain cohorts are disproportionately, if not experiencing it, at least willingly talking about it?
So again, as a person who doesn't go out and find people, they find me. I would say that I've heard this from a lot of people. I don't see a strong bias toward youth, for example, which is another question that I think people ask a lot. I hear from people of all ages, not little kids so much, because a little kid is going to be with their parents, and then a teenager is not going to come up and talk to some random adult. But people from their late teens into their 80s speak with me. People of all races speak with me. People of all levels of ability speak with me. I can't really tell how much money people have, but I'm guessing that there's a range there as well. So what people say sometimes is rooted in who they seem to be, what they're worried about, kind of how we discussed this at the beginning. But I see a range, and I think that this is taking place within many people, and taking shape within them in accordance with the other things that they have to face in their day-to-day lives.
And I think we all have kind of spoken to the fact that there are some groups that are disproportionately impacted by extreme weather events and inherently experience the mental health burden of that. And so there's been research on youth. I shared that the data from earlier about the global study that showed that young people are concerned about climate change. There's been research out of I think UC Riverside with Dr. Jade Sasser, where she's talked about even posed the question about the extent to which people's concern about climate change is actually impacting the decisions that they make about life. So there's some pockets of people that are impacted more so than others, whether it's the redlining that you mentioned or something else. But, we're all impacted by it in general. And so I think it's acknowledging that, but then ensuring that we do, because I'm a researcher, hence why I keep talking about research. There are not a lot of studies on people of color and climate change. And so recognizing that it does, in fact, exist. The studies that have been done have shown that they're concerned about or have climate anxiety. And so I think it's just expanding the questions that we're having, thinking about those groups that, we really don't touch on all the time.
I just was going to add, on the research side, so Jylana is the researcher at Climate Mental Health Network. But Blue Shield of California does an annual study of Gen Zers nationwide about mental health issues. And consistently, climate has been coming up at the top. And so in 2023, it was either 68 or 69% of all Gen Zers that they polled said climate change is impacting their mental health. Within that majority, it was 71% of BIPOC youth and a lesser amount of white youth. But there is a lot, as Kate and Jylana have spoken to, a lot of data about young people. But at the same time, we've also been doing research with like parents and educators and so forth. And so, there has been an emphasis on young people, but it is across so many age groups.
Yeah.
I feel like we're in a moment where like the conversation around mental health is expanding and is getting bigger, and you often see a connection between mental health and remote work or mental health and social media. I don't feel like I generally see climate factored in. Do you all think like our concept or our understanding of mental health needs to evolve to really like bring this into the fold?
I definitely think it does. And then also when it comes to mental health, there's a lot of stigma around it. In some groups, we see it more than others. So I think that that's also like a barrier too. And then what some data have shown are that, in terms of how people experience climate emotions, like they may not call it stress. They may not call it anxiety. So it's really trying to understand what are people calling it so that we can better address it.
Also, I would add and build on that to say something that I know my co-panelists also know, which is that mental distress, mental illness are community problems. They have community solutions. That applies to climate anxiety just as much as it applies to anything else. If somebody was to say, hey, Kate, you can snap your fingers and you can get everybody to work toward the same thing in their communities to alleviate climate anxiety, what are you gonna do? I would say rent stabilization. Actually, I would say people being housed is the way to help them maintain their health, their well-being, their networks of support, their communities. And those are all the things that keep people on their feet mentally and emotionally.
Mm-hmm. I'll add one other thing. So my background's in public health, and I was at a great dinner last night. And, I haven't been in the climate space for a long time, but I have been in public health. And so one of the people asked me, like, how does it feel going into climate since you've been in public health? And I said, well, they're related. And so I think a lot of people, they disconnect health from mental health, or they separate health from mental health, and then you add climate in the mix, and then they don't see it as being connected. So I think one of the things that we need to kind of change our thinking or reframe things is that it's all connected. And so I don't feel like I'm shifting in a new direction, because to me, it's just part of it,
Totally. It kind of goes back to that. Is it a privilege? If you're worried about your light bill or your utility bill because you had to run your air conditioning twice as often, like that's climate anxiety. That's something that wouldn't, exist otherwise. It dawns on me, like we're talking about all these different spaces that these conversations can happen. Obviously, Kate has created a special bespoke space where people can come and you could talk to a counselor. You could go to a therapist in your own life and talk there. You could do it around your dinner table. Are there other spaces where you all wish this conversation was taking place, or at least a little bit more baked into things?
Everywhere. No, but I just want to say that I'm so grateful that this conversation is happening at this summit. Second, I think that, to Jylana's point, that often mental health is siloed from other issues. And so, my organization, Climate Mental Health Network, I am so passionate about working across sectors. No matter what you're working on in climate, you have to look at it through the lens of mental health. We can see the world through the lens of climate. Climate is impacting everything. And then we also have to look at it that mental health, the climate mental health impacts are affecting all aspects of the climate crisis. And so I think that everywhere you're working in climate tech, you're working in climate media, you're working in climate education, mental health needs to be part of it, because this is one, taking a climate action. It's going to make people more emotionally resilient, more physically prepared, and more impactful in their work. That being said, my organization, we can't do it all, but we have taken, our strategy is focusing on young people because of a lot of this research, and then the trusted adults in young people's lives. So we're doing a lot of work now with parents as well as K through 12 educators, knowing that we want to try to build a holistic ecosystem in a young person's life, that they, whether they're in their home, they're in school, or they're talking with friends, that they have access to tools and resources for their climate emotions.
Yep. Go ahead.
I kind of want to go back to my story about the dad that I met who couldn't afford to run the air conditioner and didn't have time to take his kids swimming. So I think that would that guy have, I talked to him at the very beginning and there was a lot of stuff that I understand now that I didn't understand then or know about. Would he have benefited from maybe something like a climate cafe where he could say, hey, this is going on with me? Maybe. Would he have benefited from some of the like ways to kind of calm yourself and the people who you're with kind of physically, somatically, relationally, so that he wasn't taking out his frustration and difficulty on the people around him? Probably. Would he have benefited from knowing that in Rhode Island, which is where I was having this conversation and where I'm from, there is a fight for utility justice going on right now, and to have what's called a percentage of income payment plan, where it's what it sounds like, your electric bill is lower the less that you're making. I didn't know about that then. I wish I did. Not just because he could have benefited from the program if it had gone forward, but because I also believe that he might have benefited from getting involved with the fight and feeling the agency that comes from trying to make something happen that will not only better your conditions, but the conditions of the people around you.
That's a great place to end it. Thank you guys so much, both for joining us at Green Festival and also just for doing this work. It's so important. It's one of the conversations I find I'm having the most in my life with people is about climate anxiety and normalizing sort of this fear. If you all would like to discuss your climate anxiety, Kate is graciously going to set up her booth, and so you will have the opportunity to do that. And I would really encourage you guys to do it because you'll get a lot out of it.
Also, Sarah is doing
together.
We're also going to be doing an art activity with the Climate Emotions Wheel. So lots of creativity and conversation. So it's over in the corner over here, and Crystal's waving her
dancing.
arms.
You can see Crystal dancing.
Thank you
She's
all
gonna show
so
you the way.
much.
Thank you guys.
Thank you all.